Now, it's kind of hard to believe, but back in the day, there was no 911. Before the 1950s, if you had an emergency, you would call the police, but there was like a few problems with that. First, you needed access to a phone, and unfortunately for many, they didn't have the money for them, you know? And then even if you did, it's like, what was the number for the police? It was some long-ass number. And most of all, if you did get to a phone and you got that police's number, there was no guarantee you were going to get through. It would take a major disaster that was on the front of every paper in the world to finally get people asking, who do we call in an emergency? Not Ghostbusters, because I know you're all saying that at home. Stop it. Well, there was a huge event that happened back in 1912 that made people really realize that we needed some sort of emergency service that we could all rely on, right? And that huge event was the sinking of the Titanic. Oh yeah, we're bringing the Titanic into this. Get in here, Titanic. Come have a seat on the couch. You see, the dispatcher on the Titanic was trying to radio for help, but the calls went unanswered. And maybe if there was some formal system in place, those 1,500 souls who died potentially could have been saved. So because of all this, England is actually the first country to act on this idea. They put an emergency number in place before anyone else on the planet, but their number was 999, which I found interesting because 9 is the last number on a rotary phone. So it's like, and that's what they were using. So you'd have to go all the way around, you know? And dialing it 3 times kind of takes a while. It's like, you gotta wait for it. It's like if you're dying, do you want to wait that long? No. But they actually chose this because 9 is the easiest number to find on a rotary phone, especially if you're in like a dark room or maybe there's smoke in the area. In other words, if you're in like an emergency situation, everyone kind of knew where 9 was. Couldn't miss it. If it were up to me, it would be 111, right? But who am I? No one comes to me for answers in 1912. It's pretty smart. Everyone knows where 9's at, right? But honestly, I was like, I think they just want you to die. Because, I mean, that takes a long time. Weed them out. But this episode is all about 911, which belongs to the good old United States of America, baby. And the origin of this iconic number starts, once again, with a very dark story. Hi, this is Dark History. You think it's going to be all rainbows and lollipops? No. It's dark. Which brings us to Queens, New York, baby. And the year is 1964. Now, New York City during this time, they were having like a huge spike in violent crimes. There were tons of muggings happening in the streets, murders taking place all around, stores constantly getting robbed, and there seemed to be more and more victims of rape. Well, on March 13th, 28-year-old Kitty Genovese was ending her shift at the local bar where she worked as a manager. Now, this evening was like so many others for her. She does her closing duties, grabs her things, and then starts heading home. Now, mind you, when she got off this night, it was about 3 a.m. And, nothing good seems to happen around this time, but it's what time she got off. So Kitty drives herself home to her neighborhood called Kew Gardens. Now, Kew Gardens is a pretty big, diverse community within Queens, but at the same time, it also had like that small town vibe. And that's why Kitty and her girlfriend chose this neighborhood. It felt safe. So Kitty parks her car across the street from her apartment, just ready to call it a night, But what Kitty didn't know was that she wasn't alone. A stranger was lurking in the shadows, following Kitty home. And I'm not just trying to be creepy. There were lots of shadows because the thing about Kew Gardens is that there weren't any streetlights at the time. Spooky, huh? Kitty gets out of her car. She walks across the street to her apartment complex. And then suddenly she's ambushed. A man jumps out of the bushes and stabs her twice with like a big old hunting knife in her back. Kitty lets out a blood-curdling scream saying like, "Oh my God, he stabbed me." And unfortunately, the second stab had punctured Kitty's lung, and she was no longer able to scream. Terrifying, oh my God. Now, it's too dark for Kitty's neighbors to see, what's going on outside, but it's clear that there's something bad going on. And a guy even yells out his window, "Leave that girl alone!" Now, this scares Kitty's attacker. He ends up taking off, leaving Kitty bleeding on the sidewalk. This is a pretty busy neighborhood, and a lot is going on at night, so screaming really wasn't out of the ordinary around there. So people, they're like, someone's screaming, probably having a party, whatever, and they go back to sleep. you know? But it wasn't because they didn't care. It was kind of like a normal thing. And this kind of reminded me of when I lived in my small apartment in Los Angeles. Like, I would always hear screaming, and it just became a normal to the point where you didn't think twice about it. Oh my God, I'm part of the problem. Oh God. So one neighbor opened the door and saw Kitty bleeding out. He didn't want to call the police. And there's a horrible reason why. He was actually a part of the queer community, and many of Kitty's neighbors were also members of the queer community. If you remember back to our Pride episode, the queer community and the New York Police Department did not get along. This all came to a head during the Stonewall riots because it was essentially illegal to be gay at this time. So someone else who had heard Kitty did call the police, but since this was before 911, they didn't respond until much later. Since no one is coming to help Kitty, who was still bleeding on the ground, you know what happens? Bitch. Her attacker, he comes back for Kitty because she's still there. And he's like, no one's coming for her. So this shithead continues to stab Kitty at least 14 times. Then he raped her. And then he just left her there to die, just feet away from her apartment entrance. So sad. But eventually another neighbor finally comes outside to see what was going on, only to find Kitty covered in blood, barely alive. This neighbor comforts Kitty, just hoping help is on the way. But before the police arrive, Kitty takes her last breath and she dies in their arms. Now this story ends up being front page news. The whole country knew Kitty's name, and everyone was feeling terrified of the same thing happening to them. Many were thinking, hey, if you can't walk in your own neighborhood safely, what does this say about America? And if you can't even rely on your neighbors or your community to help you when you're in a crisis, who the hell can you count on? Right? Once again, they needed to figure out what the hell to do in an emergency. A few months after Kitty's death, riots started to break out across the state. First in Harlem, then Brooklyn. So Americans wanted a guarantee of safety, and they started calling on the president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson. They're like, hey, he needs to do something. What's he doing? Lyndon seemed to be asleep at the wheel while the country continued to panic. I mean, Kitty's murder just added fuel to the fire while a long, hot summer of police riots and chaos rocked not only New York, but the whole freaking country. Historians actually called the summer of 1964 the, quote, long, hot summer of crime, end quote. Great. That sounds great. It's not until the next year, at his State of the Union speech, that good old Lyndon B. Johnson decides to take a stand. On January 8th, 1965, President Johnson tells the country, quote, every citizen has the right to feel secure in his home and on the streets of his community, which we can all agree, right? Great. But he rolls out a program called the Crime Commission to start figuring out how to reduce crime. This commission probably takes one look around at the mostly white police officers and realizes exactly why there's so much fear and tension between communities of color and the cops. Not only was their relationship with minority communities bad, but there wasn't enough minority representation in the police force. 2 years later, in 1967, the Crime Commission came out with a report titled The Challenge of Crime in a Free Society. Now this thing was hundreds of pages long and supposedly had solutions for everything from police to the courts to prison, So the commission's report gave them all instructions on how to fix this. But Johnson said the most important thing is getting police and residents working together to fight crime. And who knows, maybe there should just be one place everyone can call to get help. Idea.